ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that the moment Jason was taken out of Port Charles, the city did not merely lose a man, it lost its balance. The air itself seemed to change, as if every hallway at General Hospital, every dark corner near the docks, every guarded mansion, and every familiar street had suddenly become more dangerous simply because Jason Morgan was no longer there to absorb the blow. His departure hit Port Charles like a silent explosion. No one could fully measure the damage yet, but everyone could feel it. Fear spread first, then suspicion, then anger. Old enemies grew bolder. Old allies became restless. And beneath the visible panic, something even more dangerous began to grow, an underground current of rage, heartbreak, and secret planning that would soon drag Britt, Lucas, Carly, and Valentine into one of the darkest alliances the city had seen in years. For Britt, Jason's absence was unbearable not because it left her lonely, but because it left her unfinished. Her confession of love had come at the worst possible moment, like a desperate truth torn out of her too late to change anything. She had finally stripped herself bare emotionally, finally allowed herself to stop hiding behind sarcasm, distance, and self-protection, and in return the universe had ripped Jason away before she could even understand what that confession meant for the future. The pain of that was almost humiliating in its rawness. She hated that he had seen the truth in her eyes. She hated even more that she had seen the answer in his. The love between them had become real at the exact moment it turned impossible. That kind of timing did not create peace. It created obsession. It created the kind of emotional wound that could not heal because it had no closure. So Britt did what wounded people in Port Charles so often do when grief becomes too sharp to endure. She turned it into action. What Jason had slipped into her hand in those final chaotic moments became the center of everything. At first, it seemed too small, too ordinary to matter. A simple USB drive, hidden so discreetly that no one around them had noticed. But Britt understood Jason better than almost anyone. He never moved without purpose, especially when he knew he was walking into danger. If he had chosen her to hold on to that device, it meant he had already anticipated betrayal. It meant he knew the story being told about Cullum, about the shooting, about Marco, and about his own arrest was incomplete at best and corrupted at worst. That realization shook Britt to her core. Even while being dragged away, Jason had still been trying to protect the truth. He had still been thinking ahead. He had still trusted her to finish something he could not. That knowledge became both her burden and her fuel. Lucas was in no condition to investigate anything when Britt first approached him, but grief has a way of making impossible things suddenly necessary. Marco's death had hollowed him out. It was not simply sorrow. It was a brutal collapse from the inside, a sinking, suffocating sense that he had failed at the one moment in life when he most needed to be brave. He could not stop replaying every decision, every hesitation, every emotional complication that had kept him and Marco from escaping together before things turned deadly. In his mind, loss did not come from fate. It came from delay, from fear, from a love that had been real but not acted upon fast enough. The guilt was eating through him with terrifying speed, turning every memory of Marco into something beautiful and unbearable. When Britt came to him with the USB and the hard, feverish determination in her eyes, Lucas initially wanted nothing to do with another mystery, another danger, another spiral into chaos. But then he looked at her and understood something immediately. She was not chasing a theory. She was chasing the last thing Jason had left behind. And if there was even the smallest chance it connected to Marco's death, Lucas no longer had the luxury of walking away. The files on the drive did not reveal themselves cleanly. They were fragmented, encrypted in places, patched together from surveillance stills, data transfers, hidden communications, and pieces of information that only Jason would know how to connect. That made the process more maddening, but it also made it more frightening, because it was clear the material had been gathered over time. Jason had been suspicious long before anyone else was ready to admit that something far uglier was moving underneath the surface. Britt and Lucas spent hours, then days, piecing through the contents, each discovery tightening the knot in their chests. At first they found inconsistencies, timelines that did not align, location data that placed Cullum where he should not have been. Messages that hinted he was not acting alone, not improvising, not merely panicking after a confrontation. He had been moving with purpose. There was strategy in his behavior, intent, a structure around him. Then came the detail that changed everything. It was not one giant revelation, but a chain of smaller truths locking together until there was no room left for denial. Cullum had crossed paths with Marco well before the official narrative suggested. He had opportunities no one had publicly acknowledged. He had movements tied to the window in which Marco was attacked. And more disturbingly, parts of the digital trail suggested active concealment afterward, as if someone had tried to sanitize the sequence of events before anyone could reconstruct it. Britt felt physically sick when the full shape of it settled into place. Lucas did not react at first. He just stared, numb, as though the truth were too monstrous to enter his body all at once. But once it did, it shattered him in an entirely new way. Marco had not simply died in the fallout of some chaotic night. He had been killed by Cullum, deliberately, cruelly, and everyone around the aftermath had either missed it, hidden it, or been manipulated into accepting a lie. That truth transformed Lucas's grief into something much more dangerous. Until then, he had blamed himself. He had carried Marco's death like a private punishment, convinced that his own indecision and emotional fear had led them both to the edge of disaster. But now, his guilt had a target. His sorrow had a face. His heartbreak was no longer floating in empty space. It was aimed directly at the man who had stolen Marco's future, and then let the world move on, as if it were just another tragedy in a cursed town. Lucas had spent years trying to stay decent in Port Charles, trying to believe that goodness and restraint still mattered in a place constantly contaminated by violence and schemes. But Marco's death broke something in him that decency could not repair. He no longer wanted to simply mourn, he wanted to expose. He wanted to strip away every lie protecting Cullum and force the truth to hurt as much as the loss had hurt him. Britt was changing just as quickly, and in some ways more frighteningly. Love had turned her into a woman with nothing left to hide, and Jason's disappearance had turned that woman into someone with nothing left to fear. The old brittleness in her personality hardened into focus. The sarcasm vanished, the hesitation vanished. Even her pain became sharp-edged, almost elegant in its precision. She no longer thought of herself as waiting for Jason to return. She thought of herself as holding the line until he did. That distinction changed everything. The USB was not just evidence to her. It was Jason's hand still reaching for her from across forced distance, Jason telling her, without words, that the truth mattered, that he had trusted her, that he had seen her as strong enough to carry what came next. That trust became sacred in her mind. She would not fail him, she would not let his silence be used against him, and she would not let Cullum survive what he had done. When Britt brought the findings to Carly, the emotional temperature of the story rose immediately. Carly did not need a long explanation to understand the stakes. The moment she realized Jason had secretly left evidence behind with Britt before being taken away, something cold and primal moved through her. Jason trusted very few people absolutely, and Carly knew what it meant that Britt had been one of them in that moment. Instead of producing jealousy, that realization produced a harsher emotion, respect forged in shared panic. Carly and Britt were not natural allies. Too much history stood between them, too much old resentment, too many unspoken contests over emotional territory neither woman would ever fully admit aloud. But Jason changed the math. He always did. Once Carly understood that Britt and Lucas had enough evidence to strongly link Cullum to Marco's murder and to a broader cover-up surrounding the shooting, she stopped seeing the situation as a crisis to manage and started seeing it as a war to win. Valentine's involvement was what made the alliance truly lethal. Carly had fire, Britt had motive, Lucas had grief sharpened into moral clarity. But Valentine had discipline, and discipline in a crisis like this could be more dangerous than rage. He did not want Cullum destroyed quickly. He wanted him dismantled. He wanted pressure applied in layers until Cullum stopped knowing where safety was. The smart move, Valentine insisted through action rather than sentiment, was not to strike the man first, but to erase the illusion that protected him. Strip away his cover, fracture his alliances, force mistakes, make him scramble, make him reach for help and expose who was still helping him. That approach appealed to Carly's strategic instincts and chilled Lucas and Britt in equal measure, because they both recognized how easily such a plan could slide from justice into cruelty. But by then, none of them were thinking cleanly enough to care. Marco was dead. Jason was gone. Cullum was breathing. That imbalance had become intolerable. Together they began constructing a trap. Britt kept digging through the hospital side of the story, re-examining every medical inconsistency tied to Cullum's treatment and recovery. Lucas followed the trail through records, timings, and details only someone with his training and proximity could understand, searching for the exact cracks in the official version of Marco's death. Carly monitored the social damage, tracking whispers, reactions, and sudden behavioral shifts among those who might know more than they had admitted. Valentine quietly built the outer perimeter of the operation, tracing financial traces, communication gaps, and hidden links that suggested Cullum was not just a killer, but a useful one. Their investigation stopped feeling like a desperate search for answers and started becoming something far more dangerous, a campaign. As the days passed, Port Charles grew more unstable. People sensed that something was moving even if they could not name it. Britt became distant and colder at the hospital, her grief hidden under clinical control so tight it unnerved people. Lucas, once visibly broken, became almost too calm, which was worse. His composure was the kind that comes only after a person has crossed a line internally and no longer expects to return unchanged. Carly moved through town with her usual poise, but anyone who knew her well could see the violence simmering beneath it. Valentine, meanwhile, looked almost relaxed, which made him the most terrifying of all. He was patient because he believed pressure worked better when the victim did not know how surrounded he had become. The more they learned, the uglier the picture grew. Cullum was not just guilty, he had been protected. Pieces of the aftermath around Marco's murder had been softened, redirected, or blurred by people with too much power and too much interest in keeping the full truth from surfacing. That discovery sent Carly into a fury she could barely contain. Jason had been taken away under the weight of a distorted story, while the man truly responsible for one death and tied to another devastating chain of events was still being shielded. Britt took that fact even more personally. Every hour Jason spent away from Port Charles became another insult, another theft, another sign that the system always preferred men like Cullum, until someone with enough pain and enough nerve forced it to change. That pain started changing all of them. Lucas began to frighten himself. His need for justice was pure at first, but the more vividly he imagined Marco's final fear, the more justice stopped feeling sufficient. He wanted Cullum to know what loss felt like. He wanted him cornered, breathless, stripped of control. That desire filled Lucas with shame, but not enough to stop him. Britt had fewer illusions about herself. She knew she was getting darker. She knew that if Jason returned and saw what this had made her willing to do, he might hate it. Yet, part of her believed he would understand, and that belief made her even bolder. Carly recognized the same corrosion in herself and hated how familiar it felt. Love for Jason, fear for his future, fury at his enemies, those emotions had always pushed her toward dangerous decisions. The difference now was that this time she was not reacting emotionally from a place of panic. She was acting with intent, cold intent, and that was harder to justify. The final shape of their plan was simple in theory and brutal in execution. They would expose Cullum publicly only when they were certain he could not escape the fallout. Until then, they would isolate him, cut off his confidence, and make him paranoid enough to expose every weak link around him. Carly would work the emotional battlefield, turning suspicion in all the right directions and making sure the wrong people started to doubt whether Cullum was worth protecting. Valentine would close the exits. Britt and Lucas would finish assembling the proof strong enough to destroy not only Cullum's credibility, but the structure of lies around Marco's death. If that still failed, none of them said aloud what came next, but the silence itself was answer enough. They were already contemplating darker options. That was the true cost of Jason's departure. Without him, everyone who loved him was becoming a version of themselves he might no longer recognize. And through all of it, Britt held on to one unbearable thought. Jason had trusted her last. Not with comfort, not with a promise, but with truth. That meant something. It meant their story had not ended at that van door, no matter how violently fate had tried to cut it off. It meant Jason believed she could carry the weight of what came after. That belief became her heartbeat. She would find the truth. She would protect the evidence. She would stand beside Lucas in honoring Marco, beside Carly in defending Jason's future, beside Valentine in dragging every hidden layer into the light. And when Jason came back because in her heart she had already made his return inevitable, he would return to a Port Charles already transformed by what had been done in his absence. By then, Cullum would no longer be facing frightened survivors clinging to hope. He would be facing 4 people remade by grief, love, fury, and betrayal. Lucas would come for him with the cold moral authority of a man whose heartbreak had finally found its enemy. Britt would come for him with the wrath of a woman who had confessed love and then watched the man she loved disappear in chains. Carly would come for him with all the ruthless devotion she had always reserved for the people she considered her own. Valentine would come for him with the elegance of a strategist who never needs to raise his voice to ruin a life. And Port Charles, already trembling from Jason's absence, would soon discover that the real terror was not that Jason had left. It was what his leaving had awakened in everyone still standing behind.